Shooting into the sun is normally a bad idea. It creates really big highlights, really tricky shadows where it's tough to see what you're doing. But if the sunlight is glinting through something, a pane of glass, or filtering through the branches of a tree like we have here, you can create some really interesting effects. Luckily, most phones have HDR. HDR stands for high dynamic range, and it means that your phone is going to marry up pictures that have very big highlights and very dark shadows so that you can see what's going on in both. Another good reason to shoot into the light is that when light is filtering through something, such as the branches of this tree, you can create some really interesting effects. So as the sun bashes off all of the branches down here and then it hits the lens, it refracts, and you can end up with some really interesting glare and flare effects. Here we're shooting into the sun, so our bright area is obviously as bright as it's ever going to be. So we'll turn HDR on, and then the trick here is to take a lot of pictures, because as we move, you can see that the flare and the glare from the sun looks different. So super boring at that point, and then as you come across, much more interesting, and it creates these little highlights and bits of flare. And then moving just even slightly creates this big kind of science fiction lens flare effect that looks really cool. The key with this kind of photography is to move around and take lots of pictures, because they're not all going to have the effect that you want. Here, for example, I'm off by just a couple of millimeters, and the result is that it's pretty interesting in terms of the shape of the tree, the structure of my subject, but this big highlight here just isn't what I'm looking for. The next frame is way too much. As I've moved, the sun has hit this much bigger clearing in the trees, and what I've got is lens flare that looks okay across this side of the frame, although I quite like the structure down across the frame here. Everything at the top is super cluttered, super messy, and just isn't the effect that I'm looking for. You've also got the effect that when the phone has tried to expose for the lens flare, it's underexposed my tree, and you just don't get the detail that you're looking for. This one for me is my keeper. There's a bit of lens flare on it coming down across the frame. There's some nice colour in it as well, some sort of purple, orangey hues, a nice kind of science fiction effect. A little bit of lens flare up at the top, but not so much that it's distracting. And the exposure is spot on, because I have lots of greens through the rest of the frame there that keep the colour looking interesting. And then there's a little point of interest in the top.